IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Paytm Money. So we had a really interesting week on the network. Definitely check out some of the shows that came out there. We had interesting episodes on Cyrus Says, Advertising is Dead, Filter Coffee Podcast, Agla Station Adulthood, Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Pesa Vesa. All of these shows had some really, really cool guests on, and there were some really good episodes out there. Do check them out. I'm sure you'll enjoy them. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Early in April, Facebook announced a $5.7 billion investment in Reliance Jio to acquire a 9.99% stake. Now, there was a lot of discussion over what the implications were in April, and one of the biggest fears that people seem to have about the deal is that it's going to lead to a monopoly over e-commerce. We have slightly differing opinions about that, but we also have a lot of questions that we'd like to get answered in terms of how this is going to affect the future telecommunications infrastructure of the country, and most importantly, how all this is going to take shape in the middle of possible future waves of lockdowns because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So to discuss this with me today, I have with me Rohan Seth and Pratik Wagre. So let's get to the discussion straight away. Over to you. What do you guys think how do you think this deal is going to affect the shape of e-commerce in India as it stands right now?
So earlier when this deal happened, I was approached by the print and to do their talk point, and the question that sort of hit out at me was that is this the beginning of a new monopoly? And maybe it was just to get clickbait, but generally, when I Googled around, and the sentiment basically seemed to be on the fact that now that Facebook has invested in Jio, this is sort of the beginning of a new era in e-commerce, where we will see these two guys sort of just capture this whole new market of kirana stores, and it is inevitable that a new monopoly is going to come out of this. And that's where I want to begin, actually. The short version of my whole argument against this is that no, that's not a foregone conclusion. The long answer is it's because it's not so simple to establish a monopoly, especially considering the market hasn't even been properly defined yet. And this sort of takes me back to the information economics lecture I take for Takshashila, and where I talk about standards wars. Where the idea is that for a technology to become a new standard, there's basically a war when a technology wants to become a new standard. So you have, let's say, Xbox versus the PlayStation, you have the iPhone versus Android. And there are a few key assets that new technologies can have to become a standard. So the 7 assets as defined by Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, and also probably one of the best authorities if you want to know anything about information economics. The 7 key assets are: you need to have a control over an installed base of users. So intellectual property rights, ability to innovate, first mover advantages, strength and complements, manufacturing abilities, and brand name and reputation. So what we basically have here is that a lot of people have been claiming that just because Facebook and Jio have the undeniable first mover advantage, this will directly translate into a monopoly. And my argument is that it won't, because we basically have seen multiple times that doing something first does not mean doing something right. And this is most evident in recent tech history when we look at the fact that the iPad wasn't necessarily the first tablet, right? If doing something first would have meant doing something right, we would have seen Microsoft Zune be the new iPod Touch, when in fact the iPod Touch destroyed Zune. So a first mover advantage is not definitive, is what I am arguing in my column for Tech and Chronicle. And to me, it just makes no sense to say that this is inevitably going to be a monopoly. It's far from a foregone conclusion.
Rohan's point for the Facebook itself, right, came in after Friendster and MySpace in the social networking area, and they have long surpassed those guys. But there is another angle to this as well, right? If you look at this just not purely from the e-commerce lens, but if you look at the fact that as a social networking platform, Facebook is clearly the dominant platform in India with around 350 to 400 million users. I know TikTok is catching up pretty fast and helped by the lockdown. And the fact that Jio platforms, as it's now called, has about 53% of internet subscribers. Right? I'm not talking about just purely telecom, but 53% of all internet subscribers based on TRAI data. They do complement each other in different ways. Right? There is a lot of data that they can gather. People no longer say data is the new oil because look what's happening to oil. But that's still, I think, a very important aspect to consider, and this is something that probably the CCI would be considering as well when they're looking into it. But going back to what Rohan said, I think one point is important, right? We haven't yet defined what the relevant marketplace is in this scenario, and I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. Now, it's by no means an easy thing to do, but that's where you have people like the Competition Commission of India coming in and taking steps to define that.
The one thing I want to add to that also is that, as Prateek mentioned, these companies have their core competencies that make them ideally suited for something like this, right? Facebook has such a huge user base, so much data on maybe not necessarily consumer preferences, but on users and their locations and where they commute from time to time. And as far as Jio is concerned, they have a lot of your telecom data. So that is a pretty strong alliance to have. But at the same time, that is also not conclusive because other companies themselves have core competencies that, let's say, a Facebook Jio alliance might not have. Let's say Amazon has consumer preferences data, the best possible consumer preferences data that you could have or have hoped for. Also, it has a more intricate knowledge of e-commerce and how supply chains work in general. That's something that Jio and Facebook are yet to sort of establish and perfect. So, yes, core competencies differ, and Facebook and Jio do have a lot going for them. But again, it's too early to say whether this is going to be a dominant force in this market that is not defined yet.
So both of you make fair points. So let me try to kind of draw this into the scenario we're kind of in today in terms of fighting the pandemic, right? So one thing that has really struck me was how different Amazon's functioning is in the US right now as compared to how it's functioning in India. In India, it's basically been forced to restrict all of its activities purely to essential goods. Whereas in the US, it's delivering all kinds of stuff. Its warehouses are operating. Just recently, we hear that a worker died of coronavirus in a warehouse in New York. So the question that I'm trying to get to is, given the fact that the Indian government, particularly the Minister Piyush Goyal, have come out and said that there's a very clear preference for Indian Kirana stores. This is a very potent political narrative about saving the small businesses in India, especially. Right? I see that as future waves of the infection start off, as future lockdowns are imposed, as future restrictions are imposed on Amazon's activities, it seems like there's a lot of potential for Kirana stores to use JioMart, to use WhatsApp, to start to reach out to Indian consumers, especially given the fact that so many Indian consumers are just used to working on WhatsApp. It seems like a very natural step for you to be using WhatsApp to also order stuff from your local Kirana store, especially when the big e-commerce companies are facing all kinds of regulatory burdens, right? What do you guys think of that?
So I would like to sort of put this in context a lot more than the Indian approach to Amazon, and basically look at why our approach to Amazon only limits it to essential goods while the US doesn't. And the answer lies essentially, according to me, in supply chains. I'm by no means a supply chain expert, but what I can tell you is that just the way Amazon is being treated in the US, it's because a lot of the American food processing supply chain, a lot more commodities right on Amazon's and let's say Walmart's supply chain. So it's too risky for them to restrict Amazon or Walmart to just essential goods. At the same time, in India, our supply chain, it seems to be more diversified in the sense that Amazon doesn't sell everything. There are other means to get stuff as well. And whatever the reason for that may be, this is sort of the landscape that Amazon India operates in. So it's easier for the Indian government to say that Amazon should be limited to essential goods. So that other goods are taken care of by your local supplier, producer, Kirana stores, and so on and so forth. What this is going to sort of, according to me, going to spur is that we will see a let's say, increased diversification in the availability of different commodities at Kirana stores. What I mean by that is that if these Kirana stores do come online, they will gradually but surely come up with new products. So a good example for this is people might not know this. I was reading this recently. When Gillette came to India, it wasn't selling its razors as well as you thought it would. And so because India as a market is unique in the sense that there's a huge user base, but there's a lot of poverty. So what Gillette did was it stripped down the razor to its very basic fundamentals to reduce the cost by limiting the number of blades and basically made the most essential razor you could have, which is now the Gillette Presto and is sold everywhere. And I can see that happening with a lot more commodities and a lot more companies trying to strip down their products, trying to innovate to cater to these Kirana stores that might actually end up being a market of their own. So that's something I'm actually looking forward to seeing how it develops. But those are my 2 cents on the subject.
Yes, in the, I guess in the short term, curtailing e-commerce activities to essential goods might seem justified, but I don't know how sustainable it is, and I don't know if that's necessarily a policy that we should be pursuing. Right? Yesterday, it is the Kirana stores who are supplying, I think, daily essentials to everyone. But in a world where you want to enforce more physical distancing, social distancing, whatever your preferred term is, it's harder to argue for more restrictions on e-commerce. Of course, due care needs to be given to employees in the gig working ecosystem as well, because I think one of the things also in the early days you realize that your delivery crew and your supply chain was really your essential services in a sense, right? In today's world. So I think it's important to consider that aspect as well. As I said, there is potentially a political angle to this as well, right? I think there is a constituency there in terms of the small trader or the local businessman who will be happy and who will support this push. But as an overall policy right now, I don't know if we should be trying to pick favorites.
Fair point, guys. I mean, I find the long-term idea that Kirana stores will be selling more stripped down essential varieties of goods to be very compelling. But my big question is really how that that manufacturing capacity is going to develop, especially in the middle of a pandemic. There's some heartening news and some disheartening news. What we're seeing is that migrant workers, for example, across the country are now being forced to basically stay where they are by a lot of governments. We're seeing in Madhya Pradesh, for example, there's new reports coming out that labor laws are basically being simplified, streamlined to the point where employers now have far more leverage over workers. Now, the concerns that some people are raising about this is whether there is really going to be a pushback from the workers themselves, whether we're really eroding trust between between industrialists and the labor force at a time when we really, really need that to happen. So I'd be quite curious to really see how this dynamic plays out over the long term. And to your point about supply chains also, I'm a little curious to see what kind of modus operandi the government finds in terms of making sure that Kirana stores supply chains, even for essential goods, are not impacted going forward. Because I think that one of the, at least in the early stages of lockdowns, Kirana stores were really at the losing end because there was so much lack of clarity over the kind of social distancing norms that were to be followed, so much lack of clarity over how restrictive the lockdowns were. And compared to Amazon and Flipkart, those guys were at a massive disadvantage because they were basically at the mercy of local constables. So creating this network where they're all connected now directly to consumers, clearly with the backing of Jio and Facebook, which are both basically giants in the space, that's going to be interesting to see. That's definitely something to watch. But while we're on the subject of connecting them to a network, right, I want to ask you a little bit about where you see the future of Jio itself. Now, Rohan, you mentioned that Jio has fantastic telecommunications data. Now, I think the potential for a monopoly might not necessarily lie in the fact that these guys are e-commerce giants, but rather in the fact that Jio might very well end up being India's de facto telecommunications provider, especially given that the Supreme Court has recently ordered both Vodafone and Airtel to clear massive amounts of dues, which they don't really have the wherewithal to pay. So where do you guys see that going? And do you think the government should kind of ease off its policy to kind of diversify players in the telecommunications market?
That is a very tricky question. And it's also sort of huge in its implications. But the way I want to answer this is essentially that my personal belief is that you should have at least some amount of competition in the market to ensure the consumer welfare. And the fact that there is a chance that Airtel and let's say Vodafone might be forced to shut shop, it's deeply problematic. So that's where I am with this whole scenario of Jio sort of proceeding and sort of cutting costs, forcing other companies to cut costs. So I would like to see a lot more competition. Right now we have a 3+1 space. We have Jio, Airtel and Vodafone plus BSNL and MTNL. And the fact that there's a chance that this might reduce down to, let's say, a 2+1 or even to a 1+1 with just Jio and MTN, it's deeply problematic and should not be allowed to happen. But I'm not the most qualified expert, and I imagine there are other variables in this deal here. So personally, just as a value judgment, I would prefer to see more competition in the space and have the government enable that.
Yeah, again, so I don't claim to be a telecom policy expert, right? But just from someone who's been watching it, right? It seems apparent, that the issue of spectrum itself is treated like a cash cow, basically, right? And to your point, Anirudh, even Jio had some amount of AGR dues to pay, but that I think the amount was negligible compared to what Vodafone Idea and Airtel have, right? And as Rohan said, it is, and I think Vodafone Idea especially is financially in a precarious situation, right? So you could very well be heading towards a duopoly or a monopoly, and a lot of it seems to stem from the fact that we're treating spectrum as a cash cow, right? And I think that approach needs some modification, needs some change.
Okay, so guys, we've been talking mostly about Facebook. I think that we need to make a sort of nuance in terms of the fact that it's not necessarily Facebook, but really WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, that Indians really use so much. What do you think the implications are for WhatsApp? And do you see JioMart being a major player on WhatsApp now?
So my first thought when I saw this deal was that WhatsApp gains from it. And it's a testament to the fact that what WhatsApp now needs to do for growth is to monetize this whole platform. It's going to take arguably the biggest country in the world. It's going to take all its stores online. Like that's just how big WhatsApp is. And I was sort of, after I finished marveling at how what a juggernaut this deal is, I realized that this is sort of WhatsApp's attempt to be a WeChat alternative to India. We know, and for people who might not be aware of this, but WeChat has been in India for a while and hasn't taken off as well as people there might have hoped. But the idea here is that WhatsApp is probably the largest platform in terms of user base and daily active users in India. So what we are going to see is, if we incorporate payments, we're going to see that this platform is now going to go down the path of WeChat in terms of becoming a super app that not only enables communication but also payments. That's just huge for WhatsApp, because in terms, Facebook is a company that essentially wants a lot of growth, and this is a signal that India is a great market, and that if done well, WhatsApp could potentially boom into, let's say, Facebook's single biggest earner.
But a lot of that rides on how WhatsApp Pay taking off, right? The UPI based system that has sort of been in a closed but not closed beta, but not beta kind of situation, right? For the last 1 or 2 years. So I think that's going to be important. It'll be interesting to see if this deal helps grease the wheels on that in the overall context of things. The other thing that struck me when this deal was announced was also the fact that on a lot of policy issues in India, both of them have taken diametrically opposite views, right? One of your pet topics, Rohan, data localization, right? Jio has always argued in favor of it, and saying we must not have data colonization etc., etc. And Facebook, obviously being an American company, is more, borders must be open, data must flow freely across borders. So it'll be interesting to see how rhetoric around that line changes or doesn't change, right? That's going to be a fascinating space to watch as well.
And that's true. The way I sort of look at it is that, so firstly, when it comes to WhatsApp and payments in general, it's going to sort of reverse the ideology that currently exists. Right now, you have a bunch of apps that you use to make payments. I have Google Pay, PhonePe, Paytm, Beam, like 4 apps where you can make payments and then also send messages. With the entry of WhatsApp, and it has been in the sandbox for a while, as Prateek said. But so the idea is going to be, here's a platform to send messages, but you can also send money. And that's going to sort of make you ask the question of, why do you need another app if WhatsApp already has this? That's going to be interesting. To the fact of data localization, I would say that the way WhatsApp operations happen in India, and considering RBI's mandate that financial data needs to be stored for unfettered supervisory access, a lot of lobbying is going to happen. But given the current outlook, and even before the data protection law was finalized, the RBI came out with a notification saying that this needs to be stored here. So I don't see a lot of room for negotiation that WhatsApp may have. And we'll see how the space develops, but I would not put my chips on the free flow of data, especially when it comes to financial services.
Yeah. So, it was not in the context of financial services. I think it was more in the context of general conversation in the policy space. Yeah, I think on financial data, I think that bus has left the bus stop. I forget.
That ship has sailed.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions actually popped into my mind. I think the WeChat analogy is actually very powerful because of the amount of social capital, the amount of social trust that WhatsApp has by virtue of having been a free messaging platform for such a long time. Do you think there's a possibility that this JioMart deal, the fact that people are increasingly going to get used to making payments on WhatsApp, do you see it incentivizing other providers also to start using WhatsApp Pay?
I think you have a very strong point there, in the sense that what you're essentially hinting at is some sort of network effects. So if, let's say, JioMart, instead of just being in like 4 stores in Mumbai, opens up to a pan-India thing, and WhatsApp is the payment provider for that. So you would essentially then have an app you can use to message, you can use to send money to your friends or family, and also an app where you can buy stuff on shops that are not, let's say, 1-day delivery, but essentially like 30 minutes delivery or 30 minutes pickup. It's basically a step towards an extremely frictionless world tailored for India's needs. Is a pretty good expression of that, I would say. So yes, I would see a lot of people logging on to this if done well. So and plus this super app concept of just WhatsApp replacing WeChat and performing these 3 major functions of sending money to people, looking at what's available near you to buy, and also to just message, video call, chat, voice call, whatever, and put stories on. It's going to be something to witness.
Yeah, so network effects aside, right? The other aspect is that the Kirana store model is still very hard to really do well, right? I mean, if you look at the examples of someone like Grofers, right? They've had a bunch of ups and downs over the last few years. They've expanded, then they've withdrawn operations, then they've expanded again. So it is a very hard business to scale, right? You need deep pockets. So it's going to be, that aspect I think is going to be interesting to watch as well, right? Whether this I think there's no doubt that this partnership has very, very deep pockets. How much of that they leverage, and if they're actually able to execute this successfully, that's going to be a slightly different ballgame. It's a harder ballgame than that.
All right, cool. Thank you guys so much. I think I have a much better understanding of what might very well be one of the most significant deals in Indian e-commerce in recent history. So thank you guys for joining me, and thank you all so much for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we, and indeed much of the world, has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcast from.